Hello,
Hoş geldiniz.
I am Dr. Işılay Gürsu,
I'm Dr. Peter Cherry.
and welcome to the Heritage Turkey podcast by the British Institute at Ankara, BIAA.
And today we have a big cloud of dust everywhere because fresh from the Turkmen Karahöyük excavations, we have the excavations co-director, but also an honorary fellow of the BIA and an assistant professor at Bilkent University, Dr. Michele Rüzgar Massa.
Hi, and thank you for having me here.
It's great to have you. So can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your connection to the BIA, and a little bit about how you found yourself working at Turkmen Karahöyük?
So I'm Italian, but I'm also about to get Turkish citizenship.
Congratulations.
Very soon. Thank you. I've actually been working in Turkey since 2005 as a young undergrad student. And over the years, and I moved to London, and as I was doing my PhD, I came to Turkey for research, and I found the BIA and its library, and it is an amazing library, actually, for archaeology. And over the time, actually, it became my second home. And I'm very grateful, and it's a very nice group of people, and I felt really safe, and I felt, full of both interesting people coming all the time to the tea times of the BIA. I also, over time, started working for the BIA and for projects affiliated to the BIA, excavation surveys. And actually, one changing point in my life was going to Çatalhöyük, which is, of course, a BIA-sponsored project. And there I learned a lot about myself, about archaeology. And since 2009, it was always my idea to try to do something similar to Çatalhöyük. And in fact, Turkmen Karahöyük is very close to Çatalhöyük. It's a different period, it's a different kind of site. But James Osborne, who is the other co-director of the project, and I really are looking at Çatalhöyük as a model to move forward.
Can you describe the site to us a little bit? So if I close my eyes and if I try to picture the site, what do I see? Is it in the middle of a city? Is it in a rural part? Which part of Konya is it?
Right, so the site is one of the largest one of the largest pre-Roman cities of modern Turkey. And it is at the edges of the Konya Plain, just next to the modern village of Turkmen Karahöyük. And it is you can see the shape of the mound from almost everywhere in the Konya Plain. And it is today is surrounded by agricultural areas, but at the time where it was actually occupied was at the edges of the Çarşamba River Delta on one side, on the lake shores of the Hotamish Lake on the other, and facing the steppe of the central Anatolian plateau on the other. So it would have been a very diverse environment for people living there.
And what first drew you to Turkmen Karahöyük? What made you think this would be a good place to excavate?
In 2017, we started a project with Christopher Bahuber from Oxford and Fatma Şahin from Çukurova University in the Konya Plain. And before that, we actually had an extensive preparation. And one of my specialties is looking at satellite imagery to identify archaeological sites from space, essentially. And Turkmen Karahöyük was definitely the site that really took my attention. And it was so big that I even thought that it might not have been a site because it was too big compared to normal standards. So the very first day of our survey is called, regional research. We went to Turkmen Karahöyük to test if in fact that was the case. And over the next 6 years of our research, we went back again and again. And at some point when we realized that it was too big to chew for just the three of us, we involved James Osborne from Chicago University. And eventually this collaboration led to having our first season this year of excavation.
That sounds really great. So following up on that, can I ask who are the people in your team? What kind of skills do they have? How many people were there for the first excavation season?
In total, actually, we were 58 people. There were students from Bilkent and from other places in Turkey and abroad. There were something like 20 people from the village that were working with us. And there were also maybe 20, 25 specialists of different kinds of specialists, from paleobotany to zooarchaeology to cultural heritage to ceramics, all together there. And it is a very intense experience all the time to be in an excavation. It's a very intensive environment because we live together for 24 hours a day for maybe 2 months. And we make friends. We also make enemies sometimes. And it is very different from the normal life because we are literally living next to each other, maybe in conditions that are not optimal. So it's sometimes outside of our comfort zone, but it's also a very nice way to test ourselves and to make new friendships. Yeah, I really love our team. I'm very proud of how we all came together into creating something very beautiful beyond archaeology, beyond science.
And very recently, you were interviewed on TRT, so Turkish national television, talking about this. And in the interview, you stated that your aim is to prove, I believe this is the second Hittite, or the second biggest city of the Hittite Empire. Is that right?
This is one of our scientific aims, yes. I mean, actually, the TRT interview was both my first interview as an archaeologist, or ever, and also my first interview in Turkish. So it was a challenge, but also fun. And and so we have, yes, we think that Turkmenkayuk might have been the second capital of the Hittite Empire, Taruntasia. It was definitely a major city during around 3,500 years ago, just right at the time of the Hittite Empire. It had been probably conquered by the Hittites a few hundred years later when they expanded from the original core in northeastern Anatolia toward the south and the southeast. What we are trying to do is actually we are detectives. Archaeologists are detectives of the past. And even if we are characterized often as, just using the trowel and the brush, and in fact, I mean, the science behind it is quite enormous. And we are collaborating with enormous amounts of different people from different specialties, from chemistry to biology to engineers, architects, because actually what we do is trying to reconstruct past of humanity. And because humans are so varied, we also need a large variety of disciplines to cover everything. Coming back to your original questions, why do we think that this could be Taruntasia, the second capital, is a number of different bits and pieces of evidence that we're trying to collate together, from the size of the site, the period that it was occupied, to the very vague descriptions that we have of geography from Hittite texts that seem to position Taruntasia right in the area close to Turkmenkayuk. And we have specifically 2 treaties between the Hittite king Hattushili III and the Taruntasia king Kurunta, who was actually the legitimate heir of the Hittite throne, and that was kicked out by Hattushili. So Hattushili, in order to keep Kurunta happy, just carved out the Taruntasia kingdom out of the Hittite Empire and gave it to the legitimate heir. And we have these treaties that describe in very much detail the borders of the Taruntasia kingdom.
So can I ask a follow-up question from that? So you were mentioning texts. What language would those have been written in? And more generally, for our listeners that are maybe a bit less familiar, can you contextualize the Hittite Empire a little bit? Like, when was it? What parts of modern-day Turkey was it in, etc.?
So the Hittite Empire starts around 1,800, 1,700 BC, around that time, in what is modern north-central Turkey, around Çorum, Yozgat, that area there. And first, Hattusha, which is the historical capital of the Hittites, was a city-state that was competing with all sorts of other city-states. And as it started growing, it started incorporating other city-states and smaller kingdoms. So across 500 years of its existence, it started expanding westward toward Western Turkey and the Aegean coast, southward toward the Mediterranean, eastward toward eastern Anatolia and the highlands, and then into northern Mesopotamia, Syria, the Levant. And at some point, it started getting into conflict with Egypt. And so there is a famous battle, the Battle of Kadesh, when Ramses II and the King Muwatalli, the Hittite King Muwatalli, have a sort of showdown. So it is a growing, as all empires and all states, contracting, expanding all the time until its collapse around 1180 BCE. So we have a lot of text about written by the Hittite administration, especially found in the historical capital Hattusha, and most of these texts are actually written in cuneiform. So that was a kind of writing that was very common in the Near East at the time. It was invented around 3200 BC in southern Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, and then was used by administrations across the Near East. But the language in which these texts were written is called actually Nesite. So it's from the city of Nesha, which is the first city that used that language. And it is currently the oldest recorded Indo-European language. So it's part of this large group of Indo-European languages that are today mostly spoken between Europe, Iran, and India. However, there are other languages that are less common that were found in the Hattusha archives. Some of them have long disappeared, like Luvian, like Hurrian, like Kalashan, and there are all sorts of different languages that were spoken by different people within the Hittite Empire.
One of the reasons why you claim that Türkmen Karahöyük is an important Iron Age capital is because of an inscription that you yourself have found. Can you tell us about the inscription, how you found it, who helped you find it, and what does it say on it?
In 2019, when we started this intensive research project around Türkmen Karahöyük with James Osborne, we were talking with farmers, we were talking with people in the village to try to understand, how the site extended and where were the different components of the site. And we were chatting with the farmer, and at some point the farmer pointed us to a stone a few hundred meters away that had strange symbols, and this is a talk that we have very often with people, that the thing that they see symbols, they see snakes, they see, there is a huge mythology behind archaeology in Turkey. So we're not necessarily sure that there was something about this stone, but we started checking anyway, and it was in a canal. And when we started seeing that there were actually symbols, I just jumped into the canal, and one of the very few symbols that I know in Luvian hieroglyphic, which is the alphabet in which this stone was written, is the symbol for great king. And so we were immediately very excited about this discovery, and then we sent the pictures to one of the very few experts in the world that can read Anatolian hieroglyphic. It's probably one of 20 or 30 in the whole world. And once Petra and Petra Göttereboere and Theo Vandenhout translated the stone, we realized that it was about a great king Hartapu, who was already known by other inscription and lived approximately at the time of King Midas, and potentially would have been an adversary of King Midas. So we're talking about 800 to 750 BCE. The story behind the stone is actually longer than this, because over the intervening 5 years, when we started to have more interaction with the people in the village, we realized that the stone had been found originally by a guy called Ali, who had sold the stone to another guy for a fridge, in exchange for a fridge. And this guy brought the stone to his house and was trying to sell it to a local antique dealer when he killed one other villager. And so went to prison for some time. And when he came out of prison, he had a visitor in the garden. And the visitor suggested that the reason for why he got so angry and committed an homicide was because of this stone, because that was the devil's stone, written in the devil's stone. So he disposed the stone into the canal where we actually found it. So there is an intriguing story behind the stone itself.
Yeah. Social biography of things is
Right.
sometimes amazing.
Right.
I find it quite amazing about the discovery of the inscription, for instance, that we can still find things. Because if we think of all the development projects, like big dam projects or road projects, we tend to think that probably we cannot find anything archaeological anymore because it's buried under cities or buried under all these big development projects. But this can still happen. So what's your take on that?
Well, actually, it does happen a lot. In fact, when I teach Introduction to Archaeology, I like to show a puzzle of the Mona Lisa, first with just a couple of pieces, fragments of the puzzle, and then showing gradually the whole of the painting, right? And where we are currently in terms of discovering the pieces of the puzzle in Turkey about Turkish past is probably 2-3 pieces out of 5,000. So, and also something that it has to be taken in consideration is archaeology as a discipline. So not as a broad interest in the past of humanity, but as a scientific discipline that studies that past, is very, very recent. It's like 100, 150 years old at the most. And if you think that inside medicine or astronomy, probably are tens of thousands of years old, right? So while medicine does improve, but it improves into a realm that is already well known and well studied, archaeology makes quantum leaps. Every new major discovery is a quantum leap into an unknown direction. So it's very exciting to be an archaeologist.
It is very exciting.
But also, I like the idea that archaeologists, much more than any other scientist, are aware that whatever they do, whatever they say, can dramatically change 5 years from now. So we are always aware that it could be, but it could be something else. And I feel that other disciplines may take a cue from this, because presenting our work as something definitive and unchangeable, or, you know, going to the doctor and seeing the doctor being so sure about something, right? When in fact is a prediction, is a statistical sort of attempt to quantify something, but not necessarily true or necessarily testable. And I think that archaeology as a discipline has that peculiarity, that we are always aware that we are going to be contradicted 5, 10, 20, 100 years from now.
Well, you're talking there about the history of archaeology itself. And so I wanted to ask how your project fits into the BIA's broader legacy.
Mm-hmm. Well, the BIA, I think, was founded in 47 or 48. And in the first decade of its existence, James Mellard, David French, Alan Hall, they started focusing some of their projects, at least, in the Konya Plain. The world famous Çatalhöyük really started with James Mellard in the late 50s. And since then, it has attracted an enormous amount of attention, also by British archaeologists, BIA-sponsored projects, including Douglas Baird, including the excavations of Pınarbaşı and Boncuklu, and lately Türkmenkarayük. So it fits into at least 70 years of history, of interest of the British Institute into the area. and we recently did a conference in Bilkent to celebrate this commitment with Jan Hodder, of course, the historical director of Çatalhöyük excavation since 1995.
So the BIA is very proud to be one of the co-sponsors of the Türkmen Karahöyük project. The BIA was obviously founded in 1947 as well as an archaeology institute. What do you think, why is Turkey so interesting for archaeologists, and why is it so interesting for you professionally?
Professionally, actually, when I was in Rome during my undergrads, I was very intrigued by classes by Marcella Frangipane, who was at the time working in Aslantepe, another site in the Malatya region. And so I just followed her in Turkey. And at the time for me was one of the most beautiful experiences I had so far. And before going to the site, I had traveled in the southeast, and I was really in love with the country. But scientifically, I think that what Turkey provides is a lot of potential answers to very important question for humanity: how agriculture started, and starting from agriculture, how inequality and state and the social political complexity that we have today, in a sense, at least in Europe, really starts in the sort of Syria, Iraq, and Turkey and Lebanon, in that area. So for archaeologists coming to Turkey or coming to Syria, is that is a way to understand better the origins of inequality, the origins of our life today as a social group. Also, I think that archaeology is starting recently to recognize that it has been for a very long time a discipline run by Western scholars for the first 100 years of its 150-year history. It was maybe not a hobby necessarily, but a privilege of white Westerners to be archaeologists. And only really in the last 3 or 4 decades it has opened up to others in a way that it is going beyond its colonial origins. But one has to recognize that all these early endeavors, specifically in Iraq and Syria, more than in Turkey, that at the time was the Ottoman Empire, an empire that had never been conquered, and therefore was sitting uneasily with the early Western archaeologists. But we do have to recognize that there was a sense of trying to connect directly the past of this region to, the Greco-Roman Judaic civilization, right? So the origins were all often ideologically connected to the Near East, and therefore there was a sense of appropriation of that past, in a sense, trying to make it separated from modern or the recent past of this region. So anything pre-Islamic was something that was considered of value studying, and anything post-Islamic was literally dug with the digger, with mechanical excavation. So we need to recognize this and try to integrate different perspectives into archaeology.
Can I ask practically then, does that mean, so for example, in your team, you have a lot of local knowledge as well as people who have studied in Western universities, for example?
Right, yes. So what we're trying to do in our project is also to allow for social mobility, not only between our students, so when they become more experienced, our students will hopefully have the possibility to rise up in the ranks of the project. But also, we hope that this can happen with people that work with us as hired labor, right? And this is something that I think is a big problem in general in excavations, where everybody has the possibility of moving up the scale, but not the workers. And so we are actively trying to break that wall between workers and the rest of the team.
Maybe here I can also give a shout to Alison Mickle's work about local labor force, where she studied Petra and Çatalhöyük excavations. And I know that it has been quite inspirational for you when you were setting up the whole excavation as well. So it is called Why Those Who Shovel Are Silent. So maybe our audience might be interested in having a look into that work as well. Can I bring it back to the archaeology a little bit more and ask a basic question? What was the strangest thing that you have found or witnessed in an excavation?
My favorite activity in fieldwork is actually digging graves. And it may sound strange, but actually is the closest that we can ever get to the people that once lived, right? We normally, what we do as archaeologists, we dig rubbish pits, we dig foundations of houses that have been cleaned and rebuilt on top. We have very little understanding of how people actually lived, who they were. And opening up a grave, specifically from, period before monotheism, when people were putting in the grave a lot of personal artifacts that either belonged to the person that was buried there, or to the families and the friends and the wider community. So sometimes we can get glimpse of who that person was, and when we study their bones, for example, we can understand maybe bits and pieces of their life, what profession they were doing, how did they die, who they were in life. And one of the most emotional moments in my archaeological career was when I was in Çatalhöyük. In Çatalhöyük, the Neolithic Çatalhöyük, people were burying their dead under the house floors. And that was, in a sense, to keep them within the living family. And sometimes they were also remanipulating the skulls of their family member or the people that they buried, and were keeping them on the benches to really keep them close. And I remember once they were excavating the grave of a woman who had died in childbirth, and you could see the baby really in the birth canal. And so it's one of these very rare moments in archaeology when you can actually see the emotions played out in real life. And I remember 100 people going to see that grave that day.
Yes. Yeah, it must have been very moving, actually.
Yes.
Yeah. So that brings us to, I guess, our big final question for you, which is, what lessons can archaeology have for today?
I like to think archaeology as a mirror of humanity into the past. And in the same way that one could go to psychotherapy to understand their personal problems and understand the origin of the problems, and be better equipped to deal with what these problems create in their current life. I think that archaeology can provide better tools to understand modern societal-wide problems. I'm not saying that there is a direct connection necessarily, an easy sort of solution that archaeology can provide to modern problems, but definitely understanding not only the origins of inequality, for example, but understanding how also this played out through time in different periods, in different societies, can provide maybe some clues on how this can be tackled today. And I'm not one of these people that think that the past is always better. And definitely, when we're talking about early states 4,000 years ago, we are talking about really a handful of people at the top. We are talking about very simple structures of power. and not necessarily we can implement any of the solution that they had in the past in the present. But also, I think that archaeology provides a window into thinking, okay, maybe this is not the best present that we can have. Maybe people in the past had a different way of coping with things, coping with power, coping with drought, coping with all sorts of problems that they faced that we may learn from. Yes.
Amazing. We are really very grateful to have you here with us today. And I'm sure that Türkmen Karahöyük excavation project is going to provide a lot of answers, not only in the regional context, but also for this greater context that you just described to us, what archaeology can teach us about the present and the future. So we will be tuned in. We will be watching what kind of research that you will be doing. And thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. And, well, keep following for our next episode, which should be in 3 to 4 weeks. So, görüşürüz.
Görüşürüz. Thank you.
Görüşürüz.